Okay, well, again, thank you, Jake, and thank you all for being here. My name is Shannon Kachel, and I'm a PhD student in CEFS, which is the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences on campus at University of Washington. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of shift the tone altogether here, bring it down to earth and talk about my PhD research on snow leopards and other large carnivores in Central Asia. So often one of the first questions I'm asked when I'm discussing my research with somebody for the first time is, why snow leopards? What's so interesting about snow leopards? What's so special about them that you would spend all this time on the other side of the planet studying them? And so I want to give you guys a quick introduction to the species. So first of all, they live in the highest mountains on the planet. I'm a lifelong climber and mountaineer, so that's enough of an explanation for me. But for you all, they're rarely seen, they're elusive, so there's this mystery that surrounds them. They're these culturally important symbols for conservation and wildness throughout their range and really throughout the world. And they're also just intrinsically cool. They hunt their prey by chasing them down mountainsides at breakneck speeds, and then they kill them with their faces. I mean, they're tough. They also face a very real threat of extinction if we're not careful. So to better protect them, it would help us if we better understood them. And then finally, and maybe perhaps most of all, they're not only rare, but they're elusive. And so in addition to everything else, as this photo illustrates, they make for an irresistible challenge. So as I said, we really have only basic knowledge of snow leopard populations and ecology. Not even really strong enough of a baseline that we can detect changes through time or even in space to say whether an area has more snow leopards than compared to another area. So a number of years ago, I was presented with an opportunity that was irresistible for me, for sure. And that was to lead a study to determine if and how humans were impacting snow leopards in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan. And that project has subsequently, in the course of my PhD work, grown into an investigation of the interactions between snow leopards and really among snow leopards and multiple large carnivores and their prey species in the Tian Shan Mountains of Kyrgyzstan. And so for me, this was really a blank spot on the map. There was just a lot of mystery, and I had so much curiosity for this place, and I truly upended my life to go and explore it. I've spent the majority of my time over the past several years in Central Asia. I've had to learn bits of 4 languages. I've been shot at. I've been accused of espionage. And while I'd love to just tell stories and adventure tales, what I'm actually here to talk about, what I'm excited to talk about, is the science. And I hope you are too, because the science is what motivates me. The science is exciting. It's really vibrant with mystery and opportunity for discovery. And so for here for instance, I was out in the freezing cold sub-zero temperatures for weeks at a time, listening for radio signals from a collared animal. So all this mystery and science, mystery and in the science is really what compels me. So I was supposed to study how humans affect snow leopard populations and how they relate to other species, their ecology. Now, the problem is we know very little about snow leopard populations, and we're only beginning to understand about snow leopards' relationships with other species. So that's where we're going to go today. First, I'm going to talk about the work that I and many others have done to help kind of crack into this persistent question of how many. And then once we've covered that, I want to go a little deeper, delve into the relationships between snow leopards and wolves in particular, but also the prey communities that they exist with. And I want you to bear in mind, I'm not going to emphasize it, but all of these interactions I'm talking about, and certainly the methods that I'm going to talk about, apply to other systems as well, to other wildlife as well. There are definitely common themes in the study of large predators in particular, but wildlife that moves around and tries to avoid detection really broadly. So why do we know so little about snow leopards? Well, for starters, they live in remote, politically unstable, at times dangerous regions, and the climate can be volatile as well and unpredictable. And of course, they're mountains mountain specialists. They live in truly rugged terrain. And then there's this whole cast of characters and factors that my research advisor likes to call demonic intrusion. These are things like bears or bureaucracy that like to interfere and interrupt experience and experiments in our research efforts. And then finally, again, snow leopards themselves are elusive and sneaky. They actively work to avoid detection. So one of the most basic questions we can ask, and one I'm frequently asked by others, is how many snow leopards are there? How are they doing? And despite its simplicity and despite its deep relevance for conservation, this is actually an incredibly meaty, challenging question to answer. So the current consensus, depending on who you ask, and we could debate even these numbers, is somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 snow leopards remain in the wild. But we need to be really careful when we look at numbers like this, because the jargon, the acronym that we use to describe a number like this is a WAG, which is a wild-ass guess. So this number, imagine for a second that you've lost your job and you need to check in on your online banking and see how much money you've got. And the website tells you have $4,000 to $10,000. If you're a graduate student like me, you're set, you've got all the money in the world, you can retire. But the reality is the uncertainty in that number is troubling. It doesn't allow us to detect if you've maybe spent too much money or too little money, because $4,000 to $10,000 encompasses $4,000 and $10,000. So as that relates to snow leopards, there's important consequences if it's 4,000 and we act like it's 10,000. And more than that, we might want to know where there's opportunities to take our hands off and walk away and say, those snow leopards are good, let's focus on this population over here. So there's clearly a lot of room for improvement, and the good news is that we've got the tools to improve. So in these huge, rugged, wild, remote landscapes, how can we study a thing that's so difficult to even detect in the first place? Well, like all animals, snow leopards leave signs of their presence as they move through a landscape. So here, for instance, urine sprayed on a rock, territorial marking. And of course, tracks. Or maybe the remains of their prey, or my personal favorite, which is scat. I get so excited when I find scat in the field, especially a turd that is this well shaped. Because I know it contains so much information. There's information about the sex of the animal, maybe the condition of the animal from hormones, and even the genetic identity of that individual animal. So and the prey, the food that it's been eating. So there's just a wealth of information that really makes scat brown gold to us researchers. So with these clues, once we've got an idea of where they are, we can set out cameras, remote camera traps that trigger as an animal passes by, and we leave them there for months. And the results of this can make for some really rewarding science. So in addition to snow leopards, we detect wolves at our cameras, sometimes other species like lynx, bears, prey species like these Marco Polo sheep or argali, or this ibex. And I have to throw the requisite embarrassing researcher shot, and today I drew the short straw myself. I usually embarrass other people. So we do all of this because snow leopards are individually identifiable by their spots. They're like fingerprints, unique to each individual. So these shots were all taken 2 weeks apart at the same location. It's just two different individuals though. So do you all see it? So there we go. The two on the top are actually the same individual animal. So because we can recognize individual animals, we can find patterns in where those individuals move, both in space and time. And we can use those patterns to learn something about the animals that we're not detecting at our cameras, because that's the problem with wild animals. We know that we're always likely to miss some of the individuals. So with these patterns, we can then go on to make really informed predictions about how many animals there might be in an area. and those predictions are much more precise. So this graph shows how our newer methods, which incorporate information about movement, compare with some of the older methods, all applied to the same area at the same time. So the horizontal axis is snow leopard density per 100 square kilometers. And as a point of reference, Seattle is about 250 square kilometers. So the important takeaway here, with the points and bars being our estimates with each method, and then our range of confidence, our plausible range of values that might be encompassed by that estimate. And the takeaway is that our newer methods, in addition to being a little troublingly more conservative, maybe there's fewer snow leopards than we thought initially, are also much more precise. And that precision lets us detect if those populations change, or perhaps if there's differences between areas. So because these new methods incorporate information about movement, as I've emphasized, we can actually use that to make predictions about where there are more snow leopards and where there are fewer snow leopards. So now that we've figured out broadly how to count and estimate numbers of snow leopards with a precision that's informative for us, we can move on to more interesting questions altogether, I think more interesting, such as why are there more snow leopards in that northern mountain range compared to that mountain range to the south? All of which makes for a natural segue from discussing the nuts and bolts to discussing the ecology of how snow leopards relate to other species. And of course, a natural place to talk about how predator relates to other species is to talk about their prey. And of course, people have been thinking about snow leopard prey for quite a while. And this is because snow leopard prey, these wild goats and sheep in Central Asia, have been under increasing pressure for a long time from poaching, from hunting, from increased grazing pressure, competition with livestock, and even infrastructure development, building roads and electrical power lines and mines. And all of this pressure raises a red flag for snow leopard conservation, because of course a predator needs prey to eat. Without the prey, the predators will starve. But importantly, it's not just a numerical question. If there's abundant prey, but they're somehow out of reach to the predator, that doesn't do the predator any good. The functional availability of that prey might be quite low. But importantly, humans aren't the only species that have potential impacts on the availability of snow leopard prey. Other carnivores, and particularly for our talk here, wolves, can potentially have pronounced impacts on both the number and the distribution of prey animals. And as an aside, when I was showing these slides to a colleague recently, she asked, why do you have a picture of a coyote in there? And these weirdos are actually wolves in Tajikistan. And I say weirdos because there's actually an open question that there might be a separate lineage or even species in Central Asia. And so we're actively working, side project, another talk, on figuring out if there's another species of wolf there as well. So predation is clearly an evocative and forceful driver of ecosystems, what species exist in a place. But competition is also another strong force in shaping an ecosystem. So as that relates to snow leopards, there's of course wolves and bears and lynx. In some places there's common leopards and tigers and dholes. And all of these species, these predators, are sharing the same few prey species. And whenever we see species that rely on the same limited resource, we expect to see some sort of competition. So, given that we expect competition, the question then is, well, when things compete, the winner usually wins eventually, so how is it that all these species, and particularly this wolf-snow leopard pair, continue to persist together despite, presumably, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of competition? And just to illustrate, there actually is good evidence that there is competition between the two. So this is data that was gathered just by picking apart scats. I told you I love those things. And seeing what was inside. So as we see here, snow leopards and wolves, at least in this instance, are eating about the same stuff and about the same proportion relative relative to other things in their diets. So maybe they're eating the same thing, but they're somehow avoiding each other in space or in time. Well, if we look at that time part of the question, we've here got a 24-hour on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and just the level of activity relative for each species. And we can see that snow leopards and wolves are basically doing the same thing at the same times. They're hunting the same prey at the same times, relative to bears, which are mostly nocturnal. So they're not avoiding each other in time, and they're eating the same stuff. How is it that they're continuing to exist together? So I've kind of set up a straw man here, because of course snow leopards and wolves aren't the same thing. And one way in which they're very, very different is their hunting style. Wolves hunt in packs, they chase their prey over long distances, usually rolling, gentle terrain. Snow leopards hunt alone, they stalk through complex, steep, rugged terrain. And the success or the failure of each of these hunting styles is really strongly affected and even determined by the landscape context. So this is like home court advantage in sports, but taken to another level. So just like home court advantage, the landscape really affects the success of these species. And because that context changes across the landscape, it may even be that the competition between the two species comes to benefit both predators. So how can that be? Well, because predators do much more than just eat their prey. Predators, like this wolf, chase their prey. They stalk their prey. They scare their prey. And prey respond to this. So maybe they run away, maybe they spend more time looking over their shoulders, and maybe they choose to go somewhere else entirely, somewhere where the risk is lower. Oh. So in effect, prey are responding to a landscape of risk, a landscape where the risk changes from place to place. So here I've mapped out prey locations against the risk of encountering a snow leopard. And that risk of encountering a wolf might be altogether different. And in some cases, we're starting to see that it might in fact be complementary, meaning that the prey have to make trade-offs and respond to these divergent risks between the two predators. So just like us, animals are confronted constantly with trade-offs. How to spend your time, your energy. Do you go to town hall? Do you go have a meal? Do you go take a nap? Do you do other things? So in a landscape with both snow leopards and wolves, the wild prey really have to consider if they move from the open to avoid the risk of wolves into the steep places, they might be inadvertently exposing themselves to much, much greater risk from a snow leopard and vice versa. And of course, that risk ultimately would be how competition comes to turn into a facilitation, a benefit to both predators. So to investigate these trade-offs, we need to quantify the risk that each predator poses, which we do by putting GPS collars on these animals. And here we've anesthetized an animal, we've fit a GPS collar on it, and we're just monitoring it to make sure it's healthy. And these collars transmit locations every few hours, and they allow us to track and see how these animals move through a landscape, how they're using the landscape. And of course, we've collared wolves as well. And here's what some of that data looks like, with each color representing a different animal and each point a different location of that animal. And to narrow in here, I've got a snow leopard represented by yellow points and a wolf represented by the red points. And if you squint, you can begin to see that larger pattern emerging. So even though these animals are using broadly the same landscape, at a fine scale, they're using parts of the landscape that are particularly suited to their specific hunting styles. And finally, this GPS location information gives us clusters of points where animals have spent time eating an animal. So we go and we investigate on the ground, as we're doing here for a snow leopard kill way up on a mountainside where it killed an argali. And we investigate, and that helps us to understand just how risky certain terrains are, just how risky a given patch of ground is. And that, taken together with the information about how many animals there are, the density of animals in a place that we gain from the cameras, allows us to get a complete picture of how the two species are potentially affecting each other's hunting success or failure. And so to wrap up, I really want to emphasize that now we're moving into this place where better technology and better analytical tools are giving us the ability to really unlock questions that were previously impossible for us, and letting us ask questions that were beyond impossible, things that we could only fantasize about asking before. And all of this is, of course, really good news for scientists and grad students, but it's even better news for snow leopards and for conservation as a whole. And finally, I would be very much remiss if I did not acknowledge the many, many collaborators and contributors that have helped make this work possible. There are far too many people involved in this for me to name them individually. But in general, if I've said I, what I meant to say was we, and if I said we, I probably meant them. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of them and to all of you for being here. Thank you very much for your time. And if there are any questions, remember to come up to the microphones here.